So imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that like 1 in every 3 people in your city is just gone.
Right, yeah. That sounds like, I mean, it sounds like the premise of a dystopian sci-fi movie or something.
Yeah, or maybe the aftermath of some catastrophic natural disaster. The houses on your street are just empty. The local shops you used to visit are all boarded up.
And the tax base that pays for your roads and your schools has essentially just evaporated overnight.
Right. But for a tiny, real-world archipelago out in the Pacific Ocean, this isn't science fiction. It is just the cold, hard census data.
It really is.
Today, we are looking at a society standing on the absolute bleeding edge of a demographic and economic collapse. And more importantly, how they are desperately fighting their way back. So welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, our mission is to unpack this incredibly dense, multidimensional academic report. It's titled The Evolution and Resilience of the Socioeconomic Landscape of the Northern Mariana Islands, or, as you'll often see it abbreviated in the data, the MNP.
Yeah, and it is a phenomenal data set to explore. I really want to set the stage for why this specific report is so critical right now.
Please do, yeah.
So, when economists and sociologists want to understand how massive, overwhelming global forces, things like, supply chain breakdowns, population crashes, environmental degradation, how those things affect a society, it can be incredibly difficult to track those variables in a country as massive as the United States or a sprawling union like Europe.
Because there's just too much noise in the data, right?
Exactly. There are too many competing factors. But the Northern Mariana Islands offer us something completely unique. We have access to decades of multidimensional data here.
Which is so rare.
It is. It encompasses population shifts, land use, GDP fluctuations, and marine protection.
Well,
and it's all contained within this highly isolated, closed system.
Okay, let's unpack this,
Yeah.
because I know what some of you listening might be thinking right now. You're thinking, why should I care about the statistical breakdown of a tiny island territory I might not even be able to point to on a map?
Right. It's a fair question.
And the answer is that the challenges facing this microscopic geographic footprint are the exact same macroeconomic challenges that are coming for the rest of the developed world.
Yes. It is literally like a time machine.
That's the perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
The crises they are navigating right now with their workforce, their healthcare systems, their environment, these are the crises that major nations are going to be grappling with over the next 2 decades.
Absolutely. It's just playing out in a much more compressed, hyper-visible space for them.
Right.
And what's fascinating here is how the data perfectly illustrates the dual challenge of severe population loss paired with rapid aging.
Which is terrifying when you look at the numbers.
It really is, because we hear a lot of theoretical debates about what happens when a society stops growing and starts shrinking. But here, we aren't dealing with theories. We are looking at the empirical evidence of what actually breaks when a population contracts.
And conversely, what surprising elements of human resilience actually manage to survive the crash.
Yes, exactly.
So to really grasp the mechanics of this, we have to start by looking at the physical board this game is being played on. We have to look at the geographic canvas.
The physical constraints are everything here.
They are. So the very first thing the report dives into are those physical constraints of the Northern Mariana Islands. The total land area of the entire territory is just 460 square kilometers.
To give that some immediate context for you, 460 square kilometers is roughly the size of the city limits of San Jose, California, or New Orleans.
Wow. Okay, so it's small.
Very small. But unlike those cities, which are surrounded by massive continents with endless highways and, neighboring states to draw resources from this landmass, is fragmented.
Right, it's an archipelago.
Yeah, it's an archipelago surrounded by the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. That physical boundary is absolute. You can't just expand outward.
That is your entire playing field. You can't just pave a road into the next county if you run out of room. And when we actually dig into the land use data, like how that limited 460 square kilometers is being utilized, the story is frankly shocking.
It really is an eye-opener.
Let's talk about arable land. This is the land that is actually suitable for growing crops. At its historical high, the data shows arable land made up 2.17% of the total land area.
Which is already quite low, but it's something.
Right. But today, that number has crashed down to a mere 0.17%.
Yeah, and we need to pause and really examine the mechanism behind a drop like that, because land doesn't just spontaneously lose its ability to grow food.
Right. It doesn't just turn to dust overnight.
Right. When arable land plummets from 2.17% to essentially a rounding error of 0.17%, you are looking at a fundamental shift in how a society interacts with its environment.
Because, I mean, in these island microeconomies, flat, fertile land is incredibly rare.
Right. It's the most valuable thing they have. It is also the easiest land to build on. So as development occurs, whether that is residential housing, commercial real estate, or tourist infrastructure, the agricultural land is almost always the first casualty.
It gets paved over.
Exactly, it gets paved over. Or, alternatively, the agricultural sector is abandoned because the economic incentives shift.
Right.
It becomes more profitable to work in a hotel than to farm, so the land degrades or is repurposed.
I think the best way to visualize this for you listening is to imagine you are living in an apartment where your usable floor space just keeps shrinking year after year.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. So let's say you used to have this great little balcony where you could grow some tomatoes, maybe a small herb garden.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough to feed you entirely, but it was a buffer. But slowly, that balcony space gets walled off. Maybe you had to turn it into a home office to make a living. Eventually, you can't grow a single thing in your own space anymore.
And then what happens?
Well, your only option is to buy every single calorie you consume from the outside. You become 100% dependent on the grocery store down the street.
That is a highly accurate analogy, because for an island territory, that grocery store is the incredibly complex, highly vulnerable global maritime supply chain.
Which is not known for being incredibly stable lately.
Definitely not. So when your arable land drops to 0.17% of your total land mass, your domestic capacity to produce food and agricultural goods is virtually non-existent. You're stripping away the natural carrying capacity of the land.
And the data shows this erosion of natural resources isn't limited to just farming either.
No, it's systemic.
Right, the report goes deep into the forest cover as well, and it's taking a massive hit. In 1990, the islands had 334.45 square kilometers of forest. Today, that number sits at 243.6 square kilometers.
It's a staggering loss.
It's a 27% decline in forest cover in just a few decades. Over a quarter of the trees just gone.
And again, we have to ask why this matters mechanically, because when you lose 27% of your forest cover on a small island, you aren't just losing pretty scenery or a place to go hiking.
No, you're losing infrastructure, basically.
Exactly. You are fundamentally altering the ecological machinery that keeps the island habitable. Forests act as massive sponges and anchors.
Sponges for the rain.
Yeah, they regulate the entire water cycle. They absorb that heavy tropical rainfall and allow it to filter down into the island's freshwater aquifers. And, crucially, their root systems hold the topsoil in place.
Wait, let me be sure I'm connecting the dots here. If you lose the trees, you lose the roots holding the dirt. So when it rains...
When those heavy tropical rains hit deforested areas, you get severe soil erosion. And on an island, that eroded soil only has one place to go.
Directly into the ocean.
Directly into the ocean. It washes out and smothers the near-shore coral reefs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this terrestrial degradation creates a cascade effect that actively destroys the marine ecosystem, which, as we will see later in the data, is the single most valuable economic asset the islands possess.
So this loss of forest and arable land is a severe compounding vulnerability. The physical foundation that could theoretically support a self-sustaining local economy is actively eroding.
Precisely.
So if you're suddenly relying entirely on outside supply chains because your farmland is gone and your ecosystem is under stress, you have to find a way to pay for all those imports.
You need cash flow.
Right. And for a while they did. They brought in a massive workforce to build up an export economy. But when you look at how that affected the people living there, you see one of the wildest statistical rides I have ever encountered.
The demographics here are just wild.
The population story of the Northern Mariana Islands isn't just a slow, steady trend. It is a dramatic, sweeping arc from booming growth to a sudden, sharp contraction.
And the demographic data provides a very clear empirical timeline of this arc. If we rewind to the 1990s, the islands experienced explosive, positive annual growth.
Explosive is the right word for it.
Yeah, the data shows growth rates hitting staggering highs of up to 11.9% annually.
Hold on, 11.9%. I want you to really think about that number for a second. If your city grows by 12% in a single year, that means for every 10 people, there is suddenly a new person showing up.
Every single year.
Every year. That is not a baby boom. That is a gold rush. You have to build new houses, new power lines, new schools at an unfathomable pace.
It is an incredibly aggressive rate of expansion, and you are absolutely right to point out that it cannot be driven by natural births. Humans just don't reproduce that fast.
Right, so where do they come from?
A growth rate of nearly 12% is entirely indicative of heavy external migration. This is what happens when a microeconomy experiences massive structural adjustments.
Like what kind of adjustments?
Well, perhaps the introduction of a booming specific industry, like garment manufacturing in the 90s, or a surge in international tourism that demands a massive influx of foreign labor to build and staff the hotels and infrastructure.
Ah, okay, so they're importing workers.
Exactly. And this explosive migration pushed the population to a peak in the early 2000s, reaching roughly 69,000 people.
The data shows they hit that peak, and then the bottom just completely falls out.
It's a very sharp drop.
From the early 2000s onward, it is a relentless, steady decline. By 2023, the population had slid all the way down to an estimated 44,270 people.
It's a massive hollowing out.
The annual growth rate flipped completely upside down, sitting at a negative 1.9% in 2023.
And this sharp contraction highlights the profound vulnerability of an economy that is entirely tethered to external forces.
Because the people aren't staying.
Right. When you have a society whose population scale is dictated by foreign labor markets or international trade agreements or single industry booms, that population is not rooted.
So if the industry leaves, the people leave.
Exactly. When the global economic incentives shift, perhaps a trade loophole closes, or a major industry relocates to a cheaper global competitor, the population doesn't just stabilize, it actively hollows out. The jobs vanish, and the migrant workforce leaves to seek opportunities elsewhere.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because it's incredibly unusual to see a population drop by nearly a third in just 2 decades, outside of like a major geopolitical conflict or a catastrophic natural disaster.
It's very rare in peacetime.
Right. Think about the physical remnants of that loss. You have a society that spent the 1990s fiercely building up the infrastructure, the housing developments, the commercial strips, the public services, all to support nearly 70,000 people. And suddenly 25,000 of them just pack up and leave.
The spatial mismatch that creates is a massive economic burden.
Spatial mismatch. What does that mean in this context?
It means you are left with roads that still need paving, power grids that still need maintaining, and public buildings that still need air conditioning. But you have lost a third of the tax base that was paying for that maintenance.
Oh, wow. So the bill stays the same, but there are fewer people to pay it.
Exactly. The per capita cost of just keeping the lights on skyrockets for the people who remain.
And it's not just that the sheer number of people has dropped. When you look deeper into the report, you see that the internal mechanics of the population who is being born, who is aging, who is working, are completely rewriting the social contract.
Yes, the structural shifts are even more alarming than the total numbers.
The internal engine of natural population growth in the Northern Mariana Islands isn't just slowing down, it's practically stalling out.
Demographers often refer to this phenomenon as the scissors effect, and the vital statistics from this report illustrate the mechanics of it perfectly.
The scissors effect. Okay, paint me a picture of that.
So imagine 2 lines on a graph, intersecting and moving in aggressively opposite directions. First, you have the crude birth rate. Historically, this was sitting way up at 47.1 births per 1,000 people.
Which is very high.
That is a highly fertile, rapidly expanding natural population. But by 2022, that number had collapsed to just 12.9 per 1,000.
And we see that mirrored in the total fertility rate, right?
Yeah.
The average number of children born to a woman over her lifetime.
Yes, the decline there is just as stark.
The data shows it crashed from a historical high of 7.7 all the way down to 2.3. That means in a single generation, the cultural and economic norm went from having a massive family of 7 kids down to basically just replacing the 2 parents.
Exactly. The influx of new life is dramatically lower. And the mechanisms behind a fertility drop like that are complex.
Is it just about money?
Money is a big part of it. It is generally driven by factors like increased urbanization, higher costs of living, the massive expense of raising children in a modern economy, but also shifts in female education and workforce participation.
Right. As women have more opportunities, birth rates tend to fall.
Universally, yes. But while that birth rate line is plunging downward, the second line of our scissors, the crude death rate, is slowly but surely creeping up.
Because the population is getting older.
Right. Historically, it was very low, but it has now reached 4.7 per 1,000 in 2022. So the gap between births and deaths is narrowing rapidly, cutting off the natural momentum of the society.
And this creates a massive structural shift in what you guys in the data world call dependency ratios.
Yes, dependency ratios are the key to understanding the economic strain here.
Let's look at the numbers, because this is where the math gets really brutal for a society. Because families are having far fewer children, the youth dependency ratio, which measures the proportion of young dependents compared to the working age population, dropped from a historical high of 110.9% all the way down to 32.2%.
Which sounds like a good thing at first.
Right. That means historically, for every 10 working-age adults, there were roughly 11 children to support. Now, they're only about 3.
It's a massive reduction in the youth burden.
But on the other side of the spectrum, the old-age dependency ratio has exploded. It more than doubled, surging from 6.3% in 1960 to 14.2% in 2023. That is a 123% increase.
It's a very fast transition.
Now, let me play devil's advocate here and push back a bit. I want you to imagine this from a purely financial household perspective.
Okay, I'm listening.
If you suddenly go from having 7 kids to 2 kids, you have way fewer mouths to feed, fewer clothes to buy, fewer college tuitions to save for. Shouldn't the society as a whole have more money and resources freed up? Why is this demographic shift toward older citizens considered such a severe crisis?
That's a really common way to look at it, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the macroeconomic reality of how societies fund themselves.
Okay.
Your household analogy is partially correct in the short term. When a society first experiences a drop in birth rates, they often enter a period called a demographic dividend.
A dividend, like a bonus.
Exactly. You suddenly have a massive generation of working-age adults, and they have very few dependent children to support. It frees up capital, and economies often boom during this window. But the transition in the Northern Mariana Islands is happening incredibly fast, and it is compounded by that massive exodus of workers we discussed earlier.
Oh, right. So they are essentially speeding through that dividend phase. They don't get to enjoy the bonus for very long.
Exactly. They are moving rapidly from a youthful structure to an aging one. This means the overall dependency burden, the total number of non-working people relying on the working population is starting to creep back up.
But this time, it is driven entirely by the elderly.
Yes, and the economic demands of an aging population are fundamentally different from the demands of a youthful one.
How so? Like mathematically speaking.
Well, consider where the money goes. Children require schools, pediatric care, and playgrounds. These are generally viewed by governments as long-term investments in future human capital.
Right, because eventually they get jobs.
Exactly. You spend money on a child's education because in 20 years they will enter the workforce and pay taxes to replenish the system. Elderly populations, however, require different and often significantly more expensive interventions.
Like healthcare.
Massive healthcare costs. They need chronic disease management, specialized healthcare facilities, pensions, and advanced social safety nets. This is not an investment with a future financial return. It is an escalating maintenance cost.
Man, that's a tough reality to face.
It is. And the critical systemic issue is that the society is facing these escalating costs with a rapidly shrinking workforce to pay for them.
Ah, I see. So the tax base is contracting at the exact moment that the per capita cost of social care is rising. It's a fundamental mismatch between the revenue engine and the financial obligations of the society.
It's a squeeze from both sides.
You have fewer people paying in and more people needing highly expensive payouts. That is the time machine effect I was talking about. This is the exact math that is keeping policymakers awake at night in places like Japan, Italy, and increasingly the United States.
It is the ultimate structural challenge of the 21st century. How do you maintain a first world standard of living when the pyramid of your society flips upside down?
But, and this is crucial, it's not all doom and gloom on the human front.
No, definitely not. There are bright spots.
Right, because when you look past the sheer economic burden and the scary demographic math, the actual human outcomes hidden in this report are quite astounding. And that takes us to the silver lining of this whole scenario, health and human resilience.
The resilience data is fascinating.
Because despite the alarming population collapse, despite the loss of arable land and the economic volatility, the data shows absolutely incredible triumphs in public health.
The health metrics are a profound testament to the island's social resilience. Honestly, the most striking data point in the entire report might be the life expectancy at birth.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
In 1960, life expectancy on the islands was just 61.4 years. But by 2022, it had steadily and remarkably improved to an impressive 78.8 years.
Nearly 79 years old. That is a massive leap in human longevity. You are giving an entire population nearly 2 extra decades of life.
It is a monumental achievement. and it reflects decades of consistent, targeted improvements in medical care, sanitation, living standards, and public health initiatives.
And there's a gender breakdown there too, right?
Yes, there is a significant gender gap within this achievement that aligns with broader global trends. Female life expectancy has reached nearly 80.7 years compared to 77.1 years for males.
Wow, almost 81 for women.
And this longevity isn't just happening by chance, it is supported by foundational public health infrastructure. For instance, the data indicates that basic drinking water services have reached 100% coverage across the territory.
I want to try a different analogy here to really capture how weird and impressive this is. Think of this society like a hospital situated on a sinking ship.
A hospital on a sinking ship, okay.
Right, so the ship itself, the macroeconomic output, the total population, the industrial base, is taking on water. It is slowly sinking. But inside the hospital on that ship, the doctors are getting better every single year.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
The surgical equipment is state-of-the-art. The water is perfectly sterile. The fundamental quality of life and the healthcare delivery systems have improved drastically, even as the floor underneath them is wobbling.
That is a very apt way to describe the decoupling of social resilience from economic output.
Because usually we assume those two things move together.
We do. We often conflate economic contraction with an immediate collapse in living standards. We assume that if the GDP shrinks and the population drops, society reverts to the dark ages. But the Northern Mariana Islands prove otherwise.
They managed to separate the two.
The institutions responsible for public health and basic services managed to not only hold the line, but actively improve the baseline quality of life. They protected the human element from the extreme volatility of the economic machinery.
It is incredibly hopeful. It shows that human welfare doesn't have to be perfectly tied to relentless economic growth. But keeping that hospital running, paying the doctors, filtering that drinking water to 100% of the population that requires funding.
It requires a lot of capital.
Right. It requires a continuously functioning economy to pay for those sophisticated safety features.
Which brings us to the most terrifying part of the data. How is the economy actually doing? How does a shrinking population with a growing elderly demographic fund a modern first world standard of living?
To understand the economic reality of the Northern Mariana Islands, we have to look at their gross domestic product. If the population data was a sweeping arc, the GDP is a violent, unpredictable roller coaster.
The roller coaster is putting it mildly.
It is an economy defined entirely by its extreme vulnerability as an open, micro-island economy.
Let's look at the numbers. The report uses constant 2015 prices for its GDP data. Can you quickly explain what that means before we look at the drop? Certainly. Using constant prices simply means the economists have stripped out the effects of inflation.
Okay.
If you just look at the raw dollar amount an economy produces year over year, it might look like it's growing, but that might just be because the price of a loaf of bread went up.
So it's a fake growth.
Right. By anchoring the data to the value of $1 in 2015, we get a clear, unobstructed look at the real economic output, the actual volume of goods and services produced.
Okay, so looking at the real inflation-adjusted output, the data is staggering. In 2016, the GDP hit an impressive $1.44 billion.
A very solid number for them.
But in just 4 years, by 2020, it suffered a massive, debilitating contraction, dropping all the way down to roughly $0.89 billion.
Yeah, 0.89.
Let me repeat that. $1.44 billion down to $0.89 billion in 4 years. That is an enormous amount of wealth and economic activity just wiped off the map.
But it's a catastrophic contraction. And to highlight how structurally vulnerable the system is, we need to look specifically at the year 2019.
Okay, what happened in 2019?
In 2019, per capita GDP growth experienced a severe deep recession of minus 11.9%.
Wait, hold on. Let me look at these dates again. 2019. We are not talking about the pandemic here. COVID-19 shut down global travel and supply chains in 2020.
That's right.
So you're saying their economy shrank by nearly 12% before the entire world locked down?
Yeah.
How does an entire economy just shed a tenth of its value while the rest of the world is doing fine? What actually broke?
What broke is the inherent fragility of an outward-facing microeconomy.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Larger, diversified economies like the United States or Germany have a massive domestic buffer. If their exports drop, or a specific sector like tech has a bad year, domestic consumption, millions of citizens buying cars, going to restaurants, building houses that can often keep the broader economy afloat.
Right. We spend money on each other.
But the Northern Mariana Islands do not have that luxury.
Because there are only 44,000 people there. They don't have enough people buying coffee and cars to replace a collapsed industry.
Exactly. The demand simply vanishes. Because they rely so heavily on global markets and the continuous influx of international tourism, their economic destiny is largely written by external actors.
They're at the mercy of the outside world.
Entirely. The data on trade dependency illustrates this perfectly. We are looking at historical data where trade as a percentage of GDP hit highs around 17% in the early 2000s, characterized by heavy volatility ever since.
That's a huge portion of their economy tied up in trade.
And between 2019 and 2020, exports of goods and services plummeted drastically. When international trade rates get disrupted, or when shifting currency valuations make it too expensive for tourists from a neighboring country to visit, the island's economy doesn't just experience a mild slowdown.
It hits a brick wall.
It hits a brick wall.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to wrap your head around it? It means that when we talk about economic fluctuation here, we are not talking about a bad quarter on the stock market where your retirement account dips a few percent.
No, it's much more structural.
We are talking about a scenario where the entire economic engine of the society can stall out, shrinking by a massive double-digit percentage in a single year, simply because the outside world changed its travel habits or trade policies.
It is an economy that requires the outside world to be constantly, relentlessly engaged with it in order to survive.
So how do you survive that? If you know a massive storm could wipe out 12% of your economy in any given year, you have to build a sturdy foundation to weather it.
I need a safety net.
You can't survive a roller coaster without good restraints. And for an economy, those restraints, that foundation, is infrastructure and human capital. What are the tools the Northern Mariana Islands actually have at their disposal to rebuild and adapt to these shocks?
The foundational data in the report provides a very clear picture of their modernization efforts, and it is largely a success story.
Really? That's surprising given the GDP drops.
It is, but when we examine infrastructure, the absolute most critical metric for any developing economy is electricity.
Just keeping the lights on.
Exactly. The data shows that access to electricity in the Northern Mariana Islands is basically universal, hovering between 99.8% and 100% for both urban and rural areas.
And we shouldn't gloss over that, because if you want to pivot your economy away from just relying on external manufacturing or volatile low-end tourism, you need reliable power.
It's non-negotiable.
You cannot transition an economy toward modern service industries or try to become a digital nomad hub or build high-end luxury ecotourism without guaranteed universal uninterrupted power.
It is the absolute bedrock requirement. And building on that power grid, the communications infrastructure shows steady adaptation as well.
What are we looking at there? Phones? Internet?
Both. Fixed telephone lines remain stable with around a 42.7% penetration rate. But more importantly, the indicators for digital infrastructure, such as the number of secure internet servers, show a clear, albeit fluctuating, trajectory toward digital transition.
So they're getting wired in.
They are building the digital nervous system required to participate in the 21st century global economy.
But infrastructure is useless without people to run it. And the labor force data tells a really complex story. Based on the 2010 national estimates in the report, the total labor force participation rate stands at 72.26%.
With an employment-to-population ratio of 64.1%.
Right. And looking at the human capital side, the historical data shows strong primary education persistence. The kids who start school stay in school.
Which is great for their baseline human capital.
Yes. Their statistical performance indicators, their ability to actually gather and utilize data, show an evolving capability, which is crucial for modern governance.
Yeah.
But I want to push back on those labor numbers.
Oh, what caught your eye?
There is a glaring gap in the data that feels like a massive missed opportunity.
Ah, you are referring to the gender disparity in the workforce?
Yes. The male labor participation rate is 77.6%, but the female participation rate is only 66.5%. That is an 11 percentage point gap.
It's a significant divergence.
And I want you, the listener, to consider how incredibly significant that is. We just spent the last half hour discussing the existential crisis of a shrinking workforce and a rising elderly dependency ratio. They are desperate for workers to pay into the tax base.
Absolutely desperate.
Tapping into that underutilized female workforce isn't just a social justice issue of equity. It might be the single most immediate practical way to offset the demographic collapse.
It is a huge domestic resource.
If you can't import workers anymore, you have to maximize the potential of the population you already have.
That is an incredibly astute observation, and it perfectly highlights the intersection of social policy and economic survival. An 11 percentage point gap represents a massive reservoir of untapped human capital.
So how do they tap it?
If the society can implement targeted policies that support female labor force participation, and we are talking about the mechanics of this, things like accessible and subsidized childcare, flexible working arrangements, and targeted skills training, they can artificially expand their active workforce without relying on external immigration.
It is an internal lever they can pull to generate growth and tax revenue.
It seems like such an obvious lever to pull, frankly.
But transitioning the workforce also means deciding what that workforce is actually going to do.
Right, they need a new industry.
If the garment factories are gone and mass market tourism is too volatile, what is the new engine of the economy? And this leads directly into what I think is the most brilliant and strategic pivot revealed in the entire data set.
The environmental strategy.
Yes, the islands are making a massive strategic shift toward environmental sustainability. They're essentially treating the ocean as their ultimate financial asset.
The contrast in the environmental data is incredibly striking, and it reveals a highly sophisticated strategy.
Break it down for us.
If we look at the terrestrial data, the land-based protected areas are incredibly small, making up only about 2.8% of the territory.
Right, because land is so scarce, they can't afford to lock it up.
Exactly. But when you look out at the water, it is a completely different story. An astounding 32.4% of the island's territorial waters are designated as marine protected areas.
Almost a third of their ocean space is legally protected. That is massive.
It's world-class protection.
Coupled with that, their greenhouse gas emissions are exceptionally low, sitting at approximately 0.09 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita.
This raises an important question, though. In an economy that is desperate for revenue, why dedicate so much political capital, enforcement effort, and potential ocean real estate to protection?
Yeah, why not just monetize it?
Why not industrialize the coastline or sell off mass commercial fishing rights to foreign fleets?
Because it's a trap.
Exactly. The answer is that this aggressive marine protection isn't just about saving sea turtles or preserving coral reefs for purely altruistic environmental reasons.
I mean, that's nice, but it's not the main goal.
No, it is a highly calculated, sophisticated economic strategy known as the blue economy.
Let's talk about the mechanics of the blue economy. For a microeconomy reliant on tourism, your pristine natural environment isn't just a nice backdrop. It is the primary economic driver.
It's the product they are selling.
Exactly. It is the inventory. By aggressively protecting a third of their marine territory, the islands are preserving the exact asset that tourists are willing to travel thousands of miles and spend thousands of dollars to see.
If you let commercial overfishing clear out the reefs,
Or if you let unregulated development run off into the water and smother the coral, like we talked about with the deforestation earlier, you destroy your inventory. You destroy the tourism industry permanently.
it is the realization that their competitive advantage globally isn't cheap labor or mass manufacturing anymore. They cannot compete with massive developing nations on volume.
No, they just don't have the space or the people.
Their competitive advantage is their pristine environment. The blue economy is the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods, and jobs, while rigorously preserving the health of the ocean ecosystem.
It is how you monetize nature without destroying it.
Yes. By protecting the reefs, they can pivot from high-volume, low-margin tourism to high-value, green ecotourism.
So fewer people, but they spend more.
Precisely. You attract fewer tourists, but they stay longer and spend significantly more money to experience a world-class, protected environment.
It is brilliant, but getting to the point where you can rely on a sustainable, high-end blue economy requires a lot of upfront investment.
It's not cheap to transition an economy.
You have to build a sustainable infrastructure, train the specialized workforce, and actually enforce the protected areas. You need boats and patrols for that.
Which takes cash.
And for a long time, the capital for that kind of massive investment came from the outside.
Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the training wheels. Let's look at the Official Development Assistance, or ODA.
The historical reliance on official development assistance, which is essentially foreign aid and developmental grants, is a defining characteristic of the island's economic history.
How much were they getting? If we look back to the early 2000s, the Northern Mariana Islands received staggering amounts of ODA. The data shows it equated to roughly $7,241 per capita.
That is a massive infusion of external capital.
Mm.
Imagine the global community handing your local government over $7,000 for every single person living in your city just to build up the infrastructure.
It was the crucial thrust that got the island's early development off the ground.
It literally kept the lights on.
It paid for the universal electrification, the 100% water coverage, and the hospitals that extended life expectancy to 78.8 years was the catalyst.
But the data also shows a shift there, right?
Yes. Since those early peaks, ODA inflows have seen wild fluctuations, and the overall trend is moving significantly lower.
The training wheels are coming off. Massive foreign aid was essential to build a foundation, but you cannot build a permanent resilient economy entirely on the generosity or strategic interests of outside powers.
No, because aid can vanish just as quickly as a tourist boom.
The ultimate economic mission of the Northern Mariana Islands right now is the incredibly painful, difficult transition from relying on external aid to generating internal growth.
It is a transition from dependency to true economic sovereignty. They have to utilize the infrastructure they've built and the environmental assets they've protected to finally stand on their own.
And that brings us to the ultimate conclusions we can draw from this massive, multidimensional academic report. As we wrap up this deep dive, let's synthesize the data into the three main takeaways that you need to remember about the Northern Mariana Islands, and by extension, the future of our own economies.
Okay, first, we have the social challenge. The continuous population drop and the rapid aging of the remaining citizens are the ultimate internal threats to the island's future.
The shrinking workforce and those rising dependency costs.
Exactly. They require immediate structural solutions. They are racing against a demographic clock.
Second, we have the economic vulnerability. The extreme over-reliance on external trade and international tourism makes their GDP incredibly fragile.
Very fragile. They are prone to terrifying double-digit contractions when global markets shift or supply chains break.
And third, we have the core assets. Despite those immense challenges, the islands possess universal electrification, astonishingly resilient public health metrics, and world-class expansive marine protection.
These are the strategic weapons the islands possess to fight for their future.
Based on those three takeaways, the report's proposed solutions become crystal clear. First, to fix the math of the demographic collapse, the islands desperately need aggressive immigration and talent attraction policies.
They have to replace the missing youth and workers to sustain their society.
And they have to close that 11% gender gap in the labor force we talked about. Second, they must leverage that 32.4% marine protection to build a high-value green ecotourism sector.
They can't compete on volume. They have to compete on quality, sustainability, and the breathtaking beauty of their protected oceans.
Which leaves us with a final, highly complex reality to ponder. In an era where globalization is often fiercely criticized, and where nations increasingly preach the virtues of isolationism and self-reliance, small island nations prove that absolute independence is largely an illusion.
It is. A microeconomy requires the global system to survive.
But think about the profound tension there. If a microeconomy's physical and economic survival depends entirely on attracting outsiders, both as high-spending ecotourists to fund the economy, and as new immigrants to fill the massive gaps in the shrinking workforce, how does it preserve its own unique cultural identity in the process?
That's the billion-dollar question.
How do you remain yourself when your survival requires opening your doors completely to the rest of the world?
It is the ultimate balancing act. You have to integrate with the world to survive, but you have to protect your environment and your culture so that you still have a home to survive in.
That is the tightrope the Northern Mariana Islands are walking right now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest places on the map, a tiny 460 square kilometer archipelago in the Pacific, can teach us the biggest, most important lessons about global economics, the fragility of supply chains, and the true meaning of human resilience.
Well said.
Keep exploring the data around you. And remember that shrinking apartment space we talked about earlier. Maybe the future of our global economy isn't about endlessly finding more square footage. Maybe it's about learning to live incredibly well and sustainably with the space and the resources we already have. Something to think about. Until next time.